everyone. This is Sheila Butler with Successful Women Talk. Thanks for joining me today. Super excited. We have Ashley Milne-Tyte on the show. She is the host of a new podcast and show called The Broad Experience, and it's a show about women, the workplace, and success. And if you haven't listened to it, you need to, because it is 10 to 12 minutes and sometimes a little bit longer than that, packed full of terrific information and really helpful in focusing on women. So you may have actually heard Ashley reporting for The Marketplace, which is a public radio business show, or you may have even read some of her work in the New York Daily News, Financial Times, or Wall Street Journal. She's super, super interesting lady and packed full of information, so can't wait to get started. And so help me in welcoming Ashley.
Hello.
How are you?
I'm happy.
I'm super excited to have you today. I think we met on Twitter, and I know I've heard you on NPR because I love the show. We used to listen to it back in the day when I commuted a couple of years ago. But why don't you first start by telling us a little bit about yourself, your background, and how you got to where you are today?
Sure. Well, so I came to journalism somewhat late. I did lots of different things in my 20s. My dad had been a journalist all his life and had tried to kind of push me toward it, and I had resisted. And then finally, it was around 2000, 2001, just before 9/11, that I decided I was actually going to try this for a career. So I went to journalism school in the UK, actually, just for a quick sort of 3-month course, just to sort of see whether this was the right thing for me. I decided it was. And like my dad, I went into radio. He was with the BBC World Service for a really long time. And again, as a kid growing up, I just thought radio was so boring. You know, we wished he worked in TV. We just were dying to see Doctor Who being filmed. We thought radio was very disappointing, all those voices droning out and nothing fun for kids. But when I moved here in 96 when I was 25, and I just couldn't find any international news or nothing that I considered really worth listening to on television, on US television. So I kind of fell across US public radio by accident and got really, really into it and enjoyed it and loved the storytelling that we do in public radio. And so after I came back from London, having done this journalism course, I sort of begged my local public radio station to take me on as an intern, which they did. And that ultimately led to me ending up working for Marketplace, the public radio business show you mentioned. And unlike you, I have no business background. So for me, it was the most unlikely pairing. But, you know, that show works very hard to make business interesting to a lay audience. So it was actually a great place for me to work because I didn't have any business background, but I learned a tremendous amount. And I also learned how to break down and explain dry and difficult concepts for a general audience. So it was really fun, and they're very keen that you write as creatively as possible because, again, you are often dealing with subjects that many people would consider dry. So it was very good for my writing, and I just, you know, I ended up learning so much while I was there. And that's where I kind of stumbled across this topic of professional women. I did a story, I think it was in 2004, I did a story about why single women love real estate. Why? Because the numbers are even higher now, but way more single women than single men will buy themselves a home. And that story just got me thinking about the different ways women think about money and investing and what makes a good investment for them. And gradually I just started doing more and more features that covered some aspect of women's lives, often, you know, professional women, because it was Marketplace. And I just became fascinated by the different ways men and women think about money and career, and of course, virtually everything. But when it came to career stuff, my reporting just got me really fascinated by the different ways in which women deal with work matters. And ultimately, that led me to question why so few women lead still today. And ultimately, this year, I was studying on the City University of New York, CUNY, their entrepreneurial journalism program, which essentially teaches journalists to be entrepreneurs and to be business owners. And that's where I started this podcast. That's where I started The Broad Experience, was there. because I decided that if there's this much of a discrepancy between how well women are doing in the education system and how well they're doing at work, which is, between 3 and 4% of CEOs in this country are female, there's a huge gap between most graduates being women and the number of women at the top. And of course, I say this on my website, I wouldn't want to be a CEO. I get that. Not every woman wants those jobs, but we also max out in almost every other sphere as well. We sort of max out in the middle rather than getting to the top. And I explore all the reasons for that in the podcast. I'm really interested in psychology and sociology, and it has a lot to do with that. I think sometimes in a lot of articles about this, they just bring it all down to babies. Oh, well, women have children and they're still the main caregivers, regardless of what you think about that. That's the reason. And I think it's a lot more complicated and more interesting.
I agree. I think it's easy to say that because it simplifies things. But I don't think that's really it. In one of your podcasts, you got into that. I think it was ambition and power. You talked about you and your guest talked about ambition and power, and I agree. I think it's much more complicated than that. It is very difficult to stay in that role, to get there, and then maintain it at that level and have a life. I mean, sometimes people just really want to have a life.
Yeah, exactly. I think most women, I don't have children. I still value my life and my free time and my ability to do other things greatly.
Exactly. Well, such a great foundation. There's so many paths I could go down. But first thing I want to ask is, so Dad, you always hear parents tell you to do one thing and you didn't do it. Now, finally, you're doing what your dad suggested that you do years ago. So that's kind of funny. What did he think when you finally got into journalism?
I think radio? He was pleased. I think he was sort of secretly delighted. He being a British male who was born in the 1920s, feelings, he didn't really do feelings.
Gotcha.
I think he was, my mom's American, and she said he was pleased. And I could tell in little ways. He died a couple of years ago, but I could tell he was excited in his quiet British way.
I like that, his quiet British way. Well, let me ask you this. So you did a lot of research, and you've done a lot of research on women, and I like that you said that you kind of stumbled upon reporting about women, and you didn't have a business background. So what I really like about that is that you weren't afraid to try it. You weren't out there saying, I'm the expert. You're saying, hey, I'm learning and applying different skill sets that you have, and you're making a difference, and your stories are wonderful.
Thank you. Thanks.
How difficult was it for you, though, then, to step out and get into something that you weren't overly familiar with? So you're talking about business. So how challenging was that for you?
Oh, that was hugely challenging. I mean, I was terrified. I thought, how can I talk about this? But that's the wonderful thing, obviously, about working for a show and having editors and staff around you, which is something I don't have anymore now that I'm on my own, is that there are people supporting you, and you have that person above you who's checking to make sure that you haven't made any terrible mistakes. But I think as any good reporter, I was very dedicated to making sure that I did a good job with the story. And I ended up I really wanted to honor the interviewees and make sure that I represented them correctly and all that. And I learned a tremendous amount doing it. And I think this is true, actually. This is probably a lot more true of reporters than most of us realize. Maybe you start on a newspaper, you're given a beat. You don't know anything about that beat. You've never covered it before. Maybe it's not a particular interest of yours, but you just make it your working life and you make it your business to learn all about that. And that's exactly what happened to me. And it's ironic because I was just about the least likely person to work at a business show, because I think a lot of people who go into journalism, and perhaps particularly public radio, tend to be quite artsy, and they definitely have that arts brain rather than the business brain. So a lot of us are in the same boat, maybe not having studied business or done an economics degree, but you're in this show that attempts to explain business to lay people. So the idea is, well, you're a lay person, you need to understand it first before you can translate it for the audience. So that was very, very comforting. But also, I think, and it's the same with doing this show now, there's something about being plunged into a situation where you're initially terrified. Let me do this. I don't know how to do this. That actually you learn a tremendous amount from, and you feel quite empowered afterwards, because you realize what a long way you've come, and you realize I can do it, I can learn about that.
You can. And that's one thing that I really try and talk about a lot on this show is, a lot of people have skill sets that maybe they don't even realize they have. I mean, you're a great storyteller. You're good at pulling that information out of people. And then you're terrific at making it very lay-like and understandable. So it's easy to digest, and then and it's also non-biased, which is really, it's inspiring.
Oh, good. Thanks.
I love that. Well, so let's talk about this. I know recently you did a show about ambition and power. So one of the things that you guys talked about on that show is that women tend to not ask for things as much as men do. So let's talk about that whole subject for a few minutes.
Well, this is something that I'm a prime, I'm a victim of it. Victim, I don't know if that's the quite word. I exemplify this problem, which is also partly why I'm doing this show. I'm not saying I'm this perfect person who has all the answers. Saying I'm a fairly typical female in that I was raised a certain way, and it wasn't necessarily to ask for things and stand up for myself. But I first really discovered this about myself, not because it hit me, but it was through reporting a story for Marketplace, and it was about women and negotiating, and why women, on the whole, of course, not all women are like this, but many women are not great negotiators. And there have been all sorts of studies that show that women are far less likely to negotiate than guys are. So that is when I really got thinking about this whole business of asking for things, and realized the extent to which I could have negotiated various things, and not just to do with salary and money at work at all, but smaller things with, the cable company, or there are all sorts of situations in life where I think as women often don't realize that we have more power to ask for things than that. We have that power, but we tell ourselves we don't. And when there's a wonderful book, I've recommended it, I think at least twice in a podcast I've done, or a story I've done. It's called Ask For It. And it's by a couple of women called Linda Babcock and Sarah Lashova. Linda is at the Heinz School of Business in Pittsburgh, and Sarah is on the East Coast in Boston. But they've written 2 books about women and asking, and women don't. And the first is called Women Don't Ask, and the second is Ask For It. And that book I've recommended to so many people because I learned a tremendous amount reading it. And they tell people's stories, they tell women's stories, but change their names. And there are all these just stories where a scientist was working with a guy scientist, and they were out there, getting patents and asking for more money. And she was just beavering away, doing a good job, but thinking that was all she needed to do. That's me. That's been me for most of my life. It's, my only piece of career advice came from my dad, and he meant well, but he said, just work hard and, it'll pay off. You'll be recognized. And I think a lot of women, as one of my other interviewees said in the podcast, a lot of women are told that and we believe it, and it's just not true.
I totally agree.
So I've learned a lot about all this from reporting that led me then to question my own actions. And, am I like that? Oh, yeah, I never do that. I would never have dared to ask for that raise. All these things that as women, the more I thought about it, the more I realized that there's a big difference between the way men and women are raised, still, I believe, to this day in most cases. And it's not ladylike traditionally, is it, to sort of ask, A, to talk about money,
right?
Men are very uncomfortable talking about it, but B, certainly to ask for it. And again, it's not just money, it's lots of things. And I often say being English and female is a sort of double whammy, because you've got 2 cultures telling you that it's okay to put yourself forward. I thought that talking myself up at work, I thought that was just vulgar and unnecessary, because that's the British culture, or at least it has been for a very long time. I think it's changing to a certain extent, but it's no, self-deprecating humor, put yourself down, talking yourself up was a complete no-no, and I found it very, very hard to get over that. And I still don't I'd be lying if I said I enjoyed it, but I realize that it's part of what you have to do, certainly in this country. And basically anyone who's doing any kind of work effort, entrepreneurial thing on their own, as I am now, it's absolutely mandatory.
I agree. And it's not easy. And because, even though I was raised by really great parents and they taught me to be self-confident, all those things, but I wasn't taught to ask. I mean, I think it's just different. Men are just raised to, and we're just genetically different. Like a guy, it's nothing for them to go up and ask for a raise or ask for, a certain, maybe a job promotion. And women think that if, like you said, if we continue just to work harder, people will notice that. And unfortunately, that's just not the way the world works. No. And you don't have to be, you don't have to be the B word about it, but you have to be assertive. If you want to get what you want, you have to ask for it, and it's so challenging for women.
Yeah, and it's also a really fine line, and the authors have asked for it. And I'm sure there are many, many negotiating books. The other authors probably talk about this as well, but it's such a fine line for women between being considered the B word and and being forceful enough to get what they want and need at work. Because there have been studies, again, that show that both sexes judge women harshly when they ask too aggressively. So it's much harder for us because we've got the whole culture and the working against us, the way that the culture expects women to behave, which is to be nice and retiring and not pushy. Right. But unfortunately, the work world requires some of that in order for you to get what you want and need. Exactly. So we need to sort of study this, because go too far one way and you're considered, it's off-putting to both male and female managers. Right. But of course, if you're too mouse-like, you don't get any more money.
And it doesn't matter how great of a worker you are. You can be the best worker bee in your business or the corporation that you work for, but if you don't put yourself out there and ask for those things, someone else is going to ask for it and they're going to get it. Exactly. And it took me until my late 30s to realize this. I totally bought into the, no, just keep doing what you're doing. Because that's just all I'd ever heard. Yeah. I never had career training. I mean, that's partly why I'm doing this podcast, is I want other women to realize that you have to do these things. I agree. There's plenty of literature out there for women on this now, but I'm quite surprised when I've got some really nice feedback from the podcast where people kind of say, oh, that was such an aha moment for me, kind of thing. And I think, wow, well, you're, in your 30s. And if you didn't realize that, then it shows that I need to be doing this, because too often we're so acculturated without even necessarily realizing it to be a certain way. And it's very hard to break out of that, but you have to be aware of it first. Right. And, as women, I think we're also, and some men too, but as women, I think we're taught to develop those relationships and to develop. It's why, you don't kiss on the first date. We'll just call it that. So you supposedly. So, you're taught to, nourish that relationship, grow it. It will come. And that's just sort of the mindset we have. And not that that's a bad mindset at all. I just think that if you want to excel and to succeed in whatever that success is for that individual, you're going to have to ask for some things and reach out there. It's tough. Yeah, no, definitely. Absolutely. I mean, it goes against our whole kind of way of being, like exactly as you say, and this does go back to caveman times. Women are the nurturers and the relationship builders. And just as one of my interviewees said in the last podcast, men, they go for the goal. And that, again, I think comes from the whole, I've read about this and I can't remember exactly, but it does go back to the whole hunter-gatherer days. And so we're kind of working against type to a certain extent when it comes to some of these things. I agree. Another place that you've put yourself out there is you've breached into technology. So women, we don't see women in technology as much. And so I consider podcasting a little bit technical, and you've put yourself there as well. So you're really you're pushing yourself. I am, yeah. It's interesting. It's definitely, it opens up bits of you that are kind of like the shut door that's kind of stuck, it's closed and it's stuck. Yeah, I am a natural technophobe. I will say that. And the reason, of course, I think I've got a bit of a leg up on the podcasting front because I've been a radio reporter for a relatively long time. I know how to use the equipment. I know how to get a file from my
from my kit into my computer, but I still had to learn things to do this. For instance, I had never actually mixed, which is when you put all the different voices together and any sound, because I'd worked in a newsroom where there was a whole staff of engineers who did that.
Right.
So I had never done that. So I had to learn the basics of doing that. And of course, I asked for help. There was an engineer at CUNY Journalism School who's been very helpful. But I've definitely put myself out of my comfort zone. And I've realized again, I mean, I sort of knew this, but I've really realized just in the last several months that is another, I think, vital factor to perhaps getting to the next stage of what you want to do. It can be so uncomfortable. You have to put yourself out of your comfort zone.
Just have to do it.
Course at CUNY, it was advertised as being for mid-career journalists. Now, I call mid-career, about 40, shall we say, working till I'm 70. But nearly everyone else on the course was sort of 26. And so they're totally, like a lot of them code, they're a totally different, they're the digital generation, absolutely. So even though I already did some of this stuff, because when you work alone, you have to tweet, you have to be out there and know how to promote yourself. I was still quite awed by the different way in which they've grown up with technology. And it was sort of intimidating, but also really helpful to sort of eavesdrop and learn.
Learn from those around you.
Yeah.
That's exciting. So I know you've kind of explained why you wanted to do the podcast, but how much has that helped you? I mean, how have you marketed your podcast? How are you getting out there? Because I find that there aren't as many women podcasters, and I listen to nothing but podcasts now. And there aren't as many women. There are some out there, but it seems to be more of a man's world. So how do you put yourself out there? And then how do you market that to try and grow your audience?
So yeah, putting yourself out there. I mean, this is an ongoing process for me, absolutely, because I'm doing this while also working, because this currently isn't bringing me any money or hardly any. Right. So I do a whole hodgepodge of things to earn a living, but it's really a question of the usual channels that I'm sure we all do: tweeting, right, Facebook, but also for me, it's creating awareness. Comes with things like speaking on panels like I'm doing later today. I'm speaking on a podcasting panel. I spoke at Sarah Lawrence College a few weeks ago. They had a radio festival and they asked me to speak about women in radio and podcasting. So it's a combination of literally me telling people, like, if I go to networking events, of course I'll talk about it when appropriate. I probably still am not doing as much as I should. I'm doing a lot more. But this is what I say. I still struggle with the relentlessness of the self-promotion, how much to do it, and I don't think I'm ever going to be able to just promote myself. And you don't want to do that in a cocktail situation anyway, because it's supposed to be. But of course, I try and talk a little bit about what I do and give people my card. So there's that. There are these events where I speak, and I hope to do more of those. And then sometimes, I mean, this is very ironic. Just suddenly, I went to the Third Coast International Audio Festival, which is the big public radio conference, a few weeks ago. And coming back from that, I wrote a couple of blog posts just on my regular blog about things about the conference that had sort of struck me. And for the first time, something I wrote went really viral, and it was passed around a lot in public radio circles. And I definitely got some more awareness and listens from that, because that site also links to thebroadexperience.com, where I keep the show. So it's a combination of all these strange little things. And some of them, sometimes it does feel like I'm not doing enough. How can I get more listeners? I don't know about you, but I do think it is a gradual thing. It is a word of mouth thing.
It is.
Of course, leavened with these things that I've just spoken about, such as events where I am talking to an audience, and you have the ability to hit up more people at the same time. I also, I'm a little bit superstitious about this because nothing has been signed yet, but show to a podcasting network. And the way those work is that they have sponsors. They bring on sponsors to sponsor the shows, and it's a revenue split deal. So they get half the sponsorship money, you get half the sponsorship money. And this particular podcast network got back to me and said, great. We think you really fit well with our other offerings, but nothing has happened yet. So I'm very superstitious about this kind of thing. So until I see the show on there, I'm not going to celebrate.
Did you reach out to them first, or how did that work?
I did. No. So this is funny. I had read a piece about there's a public radio. I've never met her, but I'd say colleague because we both worked in public radio. An NPR reporter called Andrea Seabrook, who was their DC, their congressional correspondent for many years. She split off from NPR and she started a podcast called Decode DC, and she just raised a lot of money on Kickstarter. And I should say that Kickstarter is something I'm thinking about as well, and that is a major way that people like us can get a lot more traction
for your show. You're thinking Kickstarter for your show?
Yeah, I know a couple of people that have done that for podcasts and they've succeeded. So that's on my radar, but it isn't something I've done yet. But I read a piece online about what she was doing, and they mentioned her podcast, that she was affiliated with this network that distributed her podcast. And so I clicked on the link to the network, and they had a pitch your show button at the bottom of the page. So I did that. And when they got back to me, which was the same day, and it was a woman who got back to me, which was sort of interesting, she said, I'm really glad to hear from you because it's so nice to hear from a woman for a change. And then she went on to say, when we began this network, we swore we weren't going to be another all-white guys talking podcast network, but then the only people who pitched their shows were guys.
It's that whole asking thing that we just talked about.
It goes to everything I talk about in my show. Women are much less likely to put ourselves forward for things. And she said, we reached out to a number of women we know who we think are very articulate and have a lot to say, and nearly all of them said no.
Really?
Went to people to say, hey, we'd love you to be a podcaster on our network. And she said most of those women said no. So that just tells you everything.
Wow. All I can say to that is wow. I can't even think of anything more intellectual to say.
I know. It's fascinating because it just backs up everything I talk about in the show, that we need to be aware that it is important to market yourself and to ask for things, exactly, and to pitch yourself. And if it's uncomfortable, which it is still for me, you just have to get over it. You just have to give yourself a pep talk and just do it and tell yourself that if you don't do it, somebody else will.
Someone else will. And no one's going to know except for the person that you pitch to. So it's not like that everyone in your family, it's not like it's going to be a big embarrassment for you. And even if you're not accepted, it's not a failure. It's a stepping stone to get to your next ask, right? So you're just helping yourself. You're building up the courage.
Yeah. No, and actually I should have said to you about getting it out there. I also, the Miami Public Radio Station, WLRN, they air one of my shows every month. So I pitched them, and again, they said yes. Now, I've pitched a couple of other programming directors in the public radio network, and they have either not got back to me or said no for us. Of course, that's disappointing, but I'm not going to stop doing it just because some people say no, because somebody's already said yes, so that's encouraging. And I know from the feedback I'm getting that it's worth continuing. So, yeah.
Wonderful. Ashley, this has been, I could talk to you probably all day, but you've got to go to your panel about learning how to pimp your podcast. So I so appreciate you being on the show. And if someone wanted to connect with you, where would you want to send them?
I would send them to thebroadexperience.com, and I would put them, the email they should use is just thebroadexperience@gmail.com.
Perfect. And we'll link all that up in the show notes as well. Thank you so much. We'll link all that up again in the show notes. And if you haven't checked out her podcast, you need to. It is a wealth of information. Ashley, thank you and have a terrific day.
Thanks, Sheila.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Okay, guys, that's a wrap on this episode. Thank you again so much for joining me. And I ask that you go over to our website, www.successfulwomentalk.com. Join our community by signing up for the email list. This is the way that our community and show continues to grow. I appreciate your support, and I'll see you in the next interview.